Alright, we've got another tool on the bench today, or a power tool rather. And this is a little DeWalt 4.5-inch grinder, and I fix a whole lot of these. They use them out in the shop, and this is actually for work. And they tend to have a lot of pattern failures. We change a lot of brushes on them. This one is going to need a new cord, and that may not even be the issue, but we'll go through that in a minute. But I figured that this would be a good thing to show people, just like the Bosch drill. These power tools are very repairable, and as long as you can get parts for them, which these DeWalt grinders, the parts are fairly readily available for most of the grinder, especially for the typical pattern failure that we see, and that also, just a not a daily user may see. Somebody that just has this out in their shop and doesn't use it all the time. The things that are going to happen to it that you may want to be able to repair, we'll kind of just show those things. So first off, the complaint on this is that when you pull the trigger, nothing happens. Uh, this is a very common thing for guys out in the shop to tell us, because they just use these things and use these things, and when they stop, there's nothing for them to troubleshoot or anything like that. They just basically say, hey, it's not working. So many times whenever we get it on the bench, we are pretty much at a blank slate to start with troubleshooting. But very few issues, very easy to go into this thing and try to repair it, and we'll go through that. Alright, so let's start off with some of the tools that really come in handy for fixing these grinders. First of all, T15 Torx. This is going to be an absolute must. If you really like, if you're fixing a lot of these grinders, it's actually handy to have a bit that you can put into a drill, an electric screwdriver or whatever, to be able to take them apart easier. But T15 is a must. Number 2, Phillips. This is handy if you're changing cords to remove it from the trigger. Small flathead. I think this is about a 1/8, maybe a little thicker. I think it's actually 5. I don't know. I think it's 5 millimeter. Just a little straight pick comes in handy. A pair of small needle nose pliers. This is really good for reaching in and grabbing little wires and brush handles and things like that. Crimpers for changing terminations if you're changing your triggers. And needle nose pliers for just general grabbing on stuff that you need to pull. Occasionally you may need something else here or there, but this will do 90% of what you're going to need to do on these grinders. Okay, so I've cut the cord off of this grinder to make it easier to work with on the bench. It needs a new cord anyways, and I'll just kind of show you why. You can see that the sheathing has actually been removed in a lot of places, and this happens because of the way that these grinders get worked. They get bent and moved and pulled and pushed on, and they really get some rough abuse out in the shop, because we use these things for everything. This one's got a wire wheel on it, but we'll put the flap wheels and the little hard pads and all kind of stuff on them. But you can also see that we've already changed this end on it. I can tell this is one that I did, because I'll remove the ground prong on there, because there's no ground. This is just a little 2-conductor cable, so I like to remove that. Just it makes me feel better. There's really no other reason to do that. And also, that's kind of a signature to where I know that I was one of the last ones to work on this thing. But it is time for a new cord, and we replace it with a factory cord, which looks like this. And your factory cords are going to come with no terminations, but the terminations are really easy to get. They're just little small FARC terminal connectors. I forget what exactly this size is, but they're easy to find. Don't get the larger ones that I believe are for like 1024 screws. These smaller ones are the ones you need. Alright, let's get to taking this thing apart. It's really easy on this back end. There's just a few screws that hold that cover in place. And that will give you access to the main guts that you're going to worry about. In this body here is just going to be the motor, and then of course you're going to have a gear system in here that sometimes you'll need to get that, and it also never hurts to actually open this up, clean it out really well, and just put a little bit of grease in there just to keep that gear system lubricated. And it's just two gears. There's a pinion gear and kind of a little ring gear in there, but sometimes the bearings will go out on those. The gears themselves, more often than not, at least for us, will strip out. And nowadays, they used to sell just the gears, but now I got to get all 5 screws out. But now they sell the entire head assembly, and they cost almost as much as a new grinder. So stripped out gears, most of the time what we'll do with that is actually just pull the head and keep the rest of the grinder as a donor. As you can see, it's pretty dirty in there. That's very common with these grinders that work with a lot of carbon steel. So we can blow that out. Keyboard cleaner is also a really good thing to have on your bench if you don't have access to compressed air. So, first thing we'll do is go through a few of these components. Let me see if I can zoom the camera in a little bit to kind of help us out with that. Definitely doesn't help out with the resolution. But you can see here, this is going to be our trigger. This is our trigger paddle, which we'll go ahead and get that out the way right now. Underneath these red covers, there's one here and one here. This is going to be our brushes. If you look really closely in there, you probably won't be able to see it on camera. I might show it to you if this is bad brushes. But there's a commutator ring. This is our cooling fan here. And this is our cord connection and boot. That's basically all that's in these grinders as far as this end. So really, like you see, not a whole lot of components. Okay, so one of the first things we'll normally check is continuity on the power cord. And with this cord being cut, it's not going to make it a whole lot more complicated to check. But all we have to do is, we have our black and our white conductor in there. And normally you do this off the end of the plug, but I'm just going to stick one of my probes into there, into the black wire for right now. And we'll check for continuity. And we'll repeat that on the other side. So we know that we have continuity throughout the cord. Now, that may not have been the case with the rest of the cord, but I really don't suspect it. Okay, next up, let's go ahead and test the trigger. And what you'll do is, if you look on the back side of the trigger, and let me actually go grab one to show you. Okay, this is a trigger from a donor meter. And just to kind of show you, it's a really basic, it's basically a 2-pole momentary switch. And your incoming lines, your black and your white, will go on here. These things are not polarity sensitive, so it doesn't matter which goes to which. And then these will be the wires going to your motor. So what we're going to do is, we're just going to probe in continuity mode from the motor side, and then we'll touch this screw on the same side, and we'll pull the trigger. You can see that that is a good trigger, at least on that pole. We'll repeat it for this side. So that's how we'll know if our trigger is good or not. And we're going to do this with this thing just in place. You really don't want to spend a whole lot of time taking these things apart to just do testing. That was me. And it takes a little bit of dexterity to do this, not much. And so we've got a good trigger on that pole. Sometimes you can get the probe to kind of stick itself in there and get a free hand. Okay, so we've established that the trigger is good. So now we'll move on to the really the most common problem with these grinders that we come across, which is that these brushes wear out. And to get access to them, we'll have to remove the cover on this side. So before we do that, we'll just make a note of the wire routing, just to kind of see where it goes, just in case everything kind of comes apart, we'll know how it goes back together. And DeWalt really did a good job on this by kind of having little spots here and there and little channels for the wire to follow and little clips for it to catch on. So it's a really, really nice setup. It makes these grinders really easy to work on. And to remove that cover, all we do is grab it and wiggle it a little bit. And there we have it. Stand by. Alright, sorry about that. Another work duty called. Hang on, let me give y'all a little bit better view of the grinder instead of my pants. Okay, so we've got this thing pulled apart, and we're just going to check the brushes. And it's pretty easy to do. Let me give y'all a little bit better view here. But there's a little steel spring here that actually holds that brush holder down, this red part being the brush holder. And I like to grab it with my small pliers and flick it up out the way. And DeWalt put a nice little stop there that holds it back for you. And then I like to do this with my pick instead of just grabbing this little connector with my pliers, because if you grab it with your pliers and you're wiggling it and you're pulling it, if the brush is still good and you pull this, there's a really good chance that you're actually going to rip this wire out of the brush, because the brush is just a graphite little brick basically. And if the brush is still good, then it's not good anymore. So it's just easier to kind of use a little pick as a lever, and you get in there and get it started and wiggling, and then there you have it. Okay, so we have definitely found the issue with this grinder. Now, if you can look, come on, can you do it? Is it on autofocus? It is on autofocus. Let's see if we can get a better focus for you. There we go. But if you'll notice, there's a little hole in this brush, and this brush is actually really bad. This is one of the worst that you'll see. But there's a spring in there normally, and a little divot, and what happens is whenever that divot kind of pops out of that brush, let me grab a replacement and I'll show you. You can see in a newer brush here that it's a smooth surface, but whenever it wears a little bit and that divot will actually become exposed and pop out, it'll stop the grinder dead. So it's actually a good little feature. It keeps from chewing up your brush covers or anything like that. So to replace this brush is a very simple little process. There we go. You just take it and guide your little connector through this hole here. Sometimes it takes a little bit of turning at the right angle. And always make sure that your brush is fully seated inside of the holder. If it sticks out a little bit, you're not going to get your spring on correctly. So just make sure it's fully seated. Fold it back, and then you just snap your spring back onto your cover and plug it in. Come on, you. Sometimes it fights. Also, resist the temptation to open this connector up a little bit to make it easier to slip on. You want it to be tight and get on there and get a really good connection. And whether or not this second brush is bad, we're going to replace it. You always want to replace your brushes in pairs, because if one is wore out, the other one is not far behind. And so in a month, you'll be changing another brush. And it's just, once you're in here, it's so easy to just do this job that it doesn't make sense to not change both brushes. So you can see that this brush is actually still going to be good, because the divot isn't showing yet. But if you compare it to a new brush, you see how much thicker that new brush is? That's why we're going to change it, because this is not going to last long. Autofocus on this webcam is worth nothing. I am taking recommendations if anybody wants to tell me a good cheap camera that would work really well for what I'm trying to do. I'm ordering another microphone because webcam microphone is pretty raunchy by itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this lead. I like to use my little flathead to kind of push the wires into where they need to go. Check to make sure nothing is pinching. There we go. Okay, so now let's go ahead and tackle this cord change here. It's pretty easy by itself. You just take out these two screws. Once again, T15s. Pretty much, I believe everything on the 4.5s are T15s. And then this is your trigger hold down bracket. And then out comes your trigger and your cord. And the first thing I like to do is take the boot, and we'll make sure that the boot is in good shape. This one looks good. We're looking for any cracking, anything, especially between this little rim and this edge. and just slide that on. I also apologize if you're picking up the radio in the background and don't like football. That's my office buddy that likes to listen to that stuff. So we can tell that this is a factory cord on here because we don't use these terminations. Whenever we change out cords, we use a fork terminal instead of just these little prong type terminals. It doesn't really matter either way. Whatever your preference is, whatever you have available to you. So what we want to do here is we're just kind of having a little dry run, a little dry fit. Is I like to have the end of my cable sheath just about a 1/4 inch, maybe a little bit less, past where my bracket is going to seat at. Let me see if I can get you in on that. You can see it stops about right here, and my cable sheath comes out just a little bit past that. You don't want to go too much past, because then it's hard to get your wires to actually bend to go into your screws right here. But the reason we're doing this is because we want to see where we want to cut these wires at. And we want to cut them with our screw terminals in mind. You can put them in if you need. But we've got our terminal set in here, and normally we'll actually have to bend the terminal to get it where it needs to be at, and it's a little bit funky with these, but it's really not a big deal. Sometimes I'll even take my flush cutters and I'll just cut down the that little extra bell that they have on the boot there. You got to be careful whenever you do this not to actually squish the terminal, but that'll give you some more room to work with. But just looking at it, it looks like we want to cut a little bit extra. That maybe about right here will be good. And if we screw up, we can always just cut this sheath back a little bit more and get it where we need to be at. And then we'll strip our wires and we'll crimp our terminals. Okay, so we've got our terminals attached here. Let's see how we did. So the first thing we're going to do is pull the trigger out and put the terminals on. And for these, we may find out that this is not going to work out as good later, but we're going to put the terminals to where the sleeve part is going to be up, away from us, away from the screw. Probably be more accurate. And then tighten them down. You don't have to dog these screws down very hard, just a little bit beyond snug. That's good there. And then now we got to kind of play with it a little bit to get everything to line up how it needs to be. So what we'll do is we'll bend the terminals towards the screw a little, just kind of away. It normally doesn't take a whole lot. And don't worry, we're not damaging these terminals in any way. As long as we're not really shoving on them extremely hard and kinking them and stuff. That looks pretty good right there. You have to get these purple wires to get into their little slots here. We'll put a little nudge there. Perfect. It's pretty important to make sure that you get these wires pushed in pretty deep into the housing, because it's easy to get them pinched whenever you put the second half of the housing on. We may have to actually bring these terminals back a little bit. And the wire does make a pretty hard kink whenever you do it this way, but it's not going to damage anything. We've been doing these just like this for a long time, and they've always worked out well. Oop. Have to remember to put your little trigger hold down bracket back in. Bear in mind too, whenever you're putting this in, that you have to pull down on these screws enough to flatten that cord out, because number one, you really want to get a good bite on it to give you the strain relief that it should, and you also have to get it down to where it is actually holding down that trigger. And it doesn't take a whole lot of force, just don't be surprised if it doesn't seem like it goes all the way down at first. Just a little bit of pressure is normally enough to get it seated where it needs to be at. And then put your other cap on. They're not normally this tricky, but we use these ID tags on ours, and sometimes it kind of catches a little bit, but it's not a big deal. What is a big deal is that every single time I forget to install my trigger paddle. That just drops right into place. There's a little kind of four-pronged little boss in there that it sits in. Luckily this time I noticed before I put all my screws in. Normally it's right after I plug the grinder in to test it that I realized that I didn't put the trigger paddle. Now if you don't have a torque screwdriver, you can use a regular flathead. DeWalt was nice enough to use the screws that you can use either one, but the Torx makes it just so much easier to do. And once again, you don't have to go extremely tight on these. One other thing that I like to do is on the four screws that actually hold the head in. There's just one here on the bottom. Is that I'll come and just check to make sure, because these are the most likely ones to actually drift out. And so I'll just make sure that they're torqued down nice, and we can in fact check these too. That one was a little loose. That one was good. These will come loose because they get knocked around a lot, and it'll actually make them come out. So just a quick little check to make sure everything stays tight. What will happen is if these four screws get loose, the head will begin to separate, and the clearance, the backlash for your gears will basically run out of tolerance, and you'll strip the gears out. Okay, safety first. I've got my glasses on, and we'll give this grinder a try. Make sure you hold on to these really well. Of course, if you're fixing it, you have experience with them, but they can give you a really good kickback, so you want to make sure you got a good firm grip before you press the trigger. Alright, so that looks like that is one working grinder. We'll bring it back to the shop and have them put it back into service. Alright, well, I hope you liked that. I'll try to do some more videos like this. I think that it's a really handy thing, you know, it's not so much electronics, but it is nice to be able to kind of show the simple little repairs on these power tools and stuff, just to help people that may not realize how simple it is to work on it. So if you like the video, go ahead and like the thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe if you're not already subscribed to me, and look out for more videos, and thank you for watching. I'll see you later, guys and girls, either or, you know.